Hello everyone, today we will be presenting our presentation titled Beyond the Binary, Changing Perspectives on Gender Roles and Identity. We are LCC's Psi Beta Psychology Honor Society, and the members who will be presenting today are Abby Sears, Michelle Moore, Jillian Card, and Alyssa Baker. There is information provided in the slides from members Heaven Harrington and Maria Bonilla. Our faculty advisors are James Jordan and Michelle Faust. We are presenting topics today including the history of gender and gendered language in the United States, the social influence of gender, gender in advertising, the neurobiology of gender, the evolution and importance of gender-inclusive language, and how to use gender-inclusive language. We are filming in June 2022, so happy Pride Month. Our goal with this video is to inform viewers of the origins of gender, as well as the social, biological factors and the importance of gender-inclusive language. We want to educate viewers on the importance of understanding these ideas that are needed to respect and value members of the LGBTQ community, and those who choose to identify different than their sex assigned at birth. We will provide tips on understanding pronouns and the proper ways to use them.
The first thing we want to do is define gender identity. So gender identity refers to a person's most innermost concept of self as male, female, or something else, and can be the same or different from one's physical sex. Another term we'll talk about later is sexual differentiation, which is the development of differences between males and females, which are widely observed in nature and also concern humans. A few examples of gender identities include cisgender being one of them. This is a gender identity that develops in line with the assigned gender at birth. Genderqueer and non-binary are not male or female, and they refer to identity rather than physicality. Transgender is identifying with a gender different from the one assigned at birth. Some other terms that we may talk about are androgyny, which is the presence of male and female characteristics in one individual. Sex is the physical or biological traits one was born with. And then sexual orientation is the enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attractions to men, women, or both sexes.
Now focusing on the history of gender, it was almost impossible to pinpoint when gender originated, but we have evidence from history that the gender binary most likely originated in the Americas in the 1600s when English settlers arrived in search of new lands. They brought ideals of the patriarchy and an encouragement of the heteropatriarchal nuclear household, where men were viewed as leaders and women as subordinates. When they eventually gained control over Native American lands in the 1800s, they began assimilating the Native American children by sending them to vocational boarding schools where boys learned farming and girls learned domestic skills. This marked a huge change in North America because now, due to English settler influence, gender became a socially constructed way to differentiate human beings. Their influence spread wide in the 1800s as missionaries also traveled to Hawaii to spread their ideals. While there, they restricted the acknowledgement of the Mahu, who are Hawaiian citizens who embrace masculine and feminine traits, and were honored and celebrated in society for being sacred knowledge holders and teachers. Because of the English settler belief that there must be separation between what it means to be a man or a woman, these people were forgotten. This continued for centuries, but as recently as 2015, the Mahu ideals and Hawaiian culture and history are being taught in schools. For example, if you take a look at the picture at the bottom of this slide, there is a picture of what a modern-day Mahu would look like. This person is a transgender woman who is also a teacher at a Hawaiian school who teaches Hawaiian history and the history of Hawaiian culture. Now focusing on the history of gendered language, some examples of gendered language from historical concepts include feminine words such as fragility, emotionality, and weakness, and masculine words like strength, independence, and brutality. These words have been used politically across decades to diminish or build other people or countries. Around the 1950s, an example of how feminization can have negative effects is U.S. policymakers viewed India leaders as passive, emotional, and weak, and this led to the loss of an alliance because of this feminization. On the flip side, how masculinization can also have a negative effect. U.S. government and soldiers viewed the Nazi regime as brutally masculine, and that instilled more fear in the citizens as well as the soldiers themselves. In the 1970s, during the feminist movement, where men and women were protesting for women's rights, the term gender finally gained contemporary usage throughout the United States. Also in the 1970s, U.S. policymakers used masculine language to justify their imperialism and violence to its U.S. citizens. In 1989, an historian named Jacqueline Dowd Hall examined Southern U.S. history and noted that when the North beat the South during the Civil War, the North used gendered language and viewed the South as a submissive wife. The influence that settler colonialism had on the gender binary is extensive, but it is still an ongoing structure that is being challenged today through research on the biological and social aspects of gender, as well as through gender-inclusive language.
We are going to be taking a look at how social and societal influences affect the perceptions of gender roles, personality, and behaviors within different studies. Some basic social concepts to mention are that statuses and roles allow us to organize our lives in consistent and in predictable ways. However, when normative behaviors become rigidly defined, freedom of action is often compromised. These rigid definitions often lead to stereotypes, sexism, and patriarchy. As gender issues have become more mainstream within scientific research and the media, there's less confusion between the definitions of sex and gender. So when biological concepts such as sex get mixed in with social concepts of roles, there is often confusion between gender roles and sex roles. In 1988, McCoby identified that sex-segregated play in children increases greatly from preschool to school-age years and remains strong through middle childhood. And this is true cross-culturally. Socialization plays a part in the children's choice of playmates. Girls are responsive to both males and females, while boys are responsive to only other male companions. This could be because concepts of gender identity and core categorical membership are seen as the primary cognitive underpinnings for segregation. Girls who had the highest scores in assertion and in activity deviated from stereotypical sex-appropriate behaviors, but were the ones who spent the most time with same-sex playmates. Effeminate boys found a tendency to play alone until they could find a more compatible male counterpart. As a cognitive social perspective, by the age of 4, most children are able to correctly apply gender labels to themselves and to other children. However, they do not use genitalia as a basis to distinguish their gender. There is more than one process in which categories are formed, some basic core categories and some are prototypical. Male and female are core categories, feminine and masculinity are prototypical. The portrayal of gender within advertisements has a direct effect on the reinforcement of gender stereotypes and gender role identity, all at an unconscious level. So because within our society, we view advertising on an hourly basis all over, it's important to examine how it's impacting us on a psychological level, specifically in the context of gender. In 2011, Olga Lupakova in Russia said that the direct perception of gender features and roles within advertising has influence on both cognitive and emotive, or conscious and unconscious, levels of our own self-consciousness and identity. The study that Olga conducted was to discover the gender characteristics of their individuals and how they viewed gender within their own self. She gave them 27 personality traits to categorize based on how they viewed different gender stereotypes, and then showed them 5 commercials involving chocolate in which different gender forms were portrayed. A week later, she then had them recategorize the 27 characteristics into different groups to see if any results had changed. What this showed was a strengthened gender differentiation enhancement within their self-identification. So those that viewed gender in this way chose the commercial that exemplified it. For example, if I viewed the ideal man or woman a certain way, then I would pick the commercial that exemplified this for me, and that part of my self-identity becomes stronger. So our direct perception within these images, especially at an age in which our minds are so malleable, they act as a launch mechanism for the process of our gender self-identity. And so that part of our consciousness and identity is reinforced. Unconsciously, gender traits portrayed in advertising spill over into the self-concept of the viewer, which is how we categorize gender in our world. Based on her results, it was concluded that these images are impacting our self-consciousness and our self-identity because of our brain's ability to adapt based on what we see and experience. This is what is meant by neuroplasticity. In knowing our susceptibility to these images, we can begin to identify ways which we are affected by the reinforcement of stereotypes.
Next, we'll talk about the neurobiological aspect of gender identity. Gender identity is a multifactorial complex trait, and it has many genetic components. The following twin studies that we'll look at show overwhelming evidence that gender identity is in part at least an inherited trait. For an example, the first study looks at individuals that were previously classified as having gender dysphoria. Across biologically sexed males and females, the study found 62% heritability. Another study looking at sex-type behavior found that for males, gendered behavior was 34% heritable, and for females, 57%. The third study measured childhood gender nonconformity, which is also known as not demonstrating traditionally assumed gendered behaviors. It was found that heritability for males was 50%, and for females, it was 37%. As you can see, there are many more studies to back up the genetic element of gender identity. New research even suggests that brain scans can accurately predict gender identity. These researchers focused on 4 types of gender: cisgender male, cisgender female, trans male, and trans female. When looking at the resting state fMRI scans of these individuals, they found that cisgender females were predicted with 63% accuracy, cisgender males were predicted at 52% accuracy, trans females were at 52% accuracy, trans males were predicted at 49% accuracy. In addition, all subtypes were predicted more accurately than when given the BSRI, which is a self-survey considered the gold standard of gender identification until recently. This brings us to a few main points. Gender identity cannot be mapped using only the binary categories of male and female. Gender identity is complex, and we still haven't determined all gender subtypes. But combined analysis of BSRI data and resting state functional connectivity has the ability to define at least 4 gender subtypes. More research may provide insight in determining a continuum of future gender identities.
Now we are going to discuss the evolution, importance, and use of gender-inclusive language. Going back to Jill's history slides, we start off in the 1990s when transgender became a prominent label for one's identity. From then through the 2010s, this gained massive publicity and was recognized in gender theories as a form of social justice due to activism of trans people. This also caused major language shifts, including inclusive language used in large institutions such as schools and medical providers, college campuses using things like pronoun pins to provide support for trans people, and non-binary and cisgender being used as prominent identity labels. And although these major shifts have caused massive change in the acceptance and inclusivity of trans people, this has become a center of public debate in the United States due to conservative perspectives. And although this controversy is happening, it is very significant because it is showing that change is happening and the world is becoming more accepting and inclusive of these people. The importance of gender-inclusive language goes back to language being the basis of mental imaging of gender, as these expectations prime gendered thinking, and because of that, it leads to social attitudes such as stereotyping and prejudice. We have several ways that we can be very conscious of our gendered language due to research that has allowed for strategies that have gained in popularity. One of the most popular is language neutralization, which is the replacement of traditionally masculine words with gender-neutral words. An example of this would be using police officer instead of policeman. Another example would be mail carrier instead of mailman. Another less popular but prominent strategy is language feminization, which is the usage of feminine qualifiers in a pairing with a male gendered noun. So, for example, if someone was referring to their mechanic and they happen to be a woman, you can say female or woman mechanic. And despite these strategies, research has really indicated that gender-inclusive language use is ultimately driven by intentional, purposeful effort. And research has also indicated that people are more likely to use gender-inclusive language when they are presented with arguments for the importance of it. So because of this, we have decided to provide you with some strategies on how to use gender-inclusive language in your everyday life. So one of the big ones is just asking someone their preferred form of address and their pronouns. Examples of pronouns are she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs. And you can also ask someone their title or their surname. So Mr. or Mrs. are examples of surnames, but someone might have a doctor degree, for example, and they might want to be referred to as doctor. Or sometimes, like, different job titles have different ways that they want to be referred. For example, a professor might want to be referred to as professor with their last name. Another way is to avoid gender-biased expressions. There are a lot of stereotypical expressions that go into gender. For example, some people will often say when a father is, taking care of their child, they will say that they're babysitting. So just being aware of things that might have biased expressions that have to do with gender. Using gender-neutral words. So if something has a gendered term to it, such as mankind, you can use humankind instead to try to make it more inclusive. Using plural pronouns and adjectives, they, them, theirs, using plural adjacents to the singular pronoun, so that would be himself or herself, and using themselves instead. Using the relative pronoun who or one instead of using them or he or she. But they, them, theirs, themselves also is a big umbrella term that you can use for all genders because it kind of includes everything. And then the last one is just omitting the gendered word in sentences where it's just completely irrelevant. There are often times where people will use sentences and they will put he or she in there, and you can just completely take it out and there's really no need for it. So with these strategies, we really hope that you can implement some of these strategies in your everyday language, and you can really see how simple gender-inclusive language can really be in your everyday life. To conclude our presentation, we have a list of questions you or your peers can discuss and reflect upon. We hope this presentation was very informative and possibly shifted your perspective on gender and gender-inclusive language.